Joined by Rikki Lambert this morning as we take a look at one of the bigger issues with Barnaby Joyce and the leadership change. And welcome to you, Rikki.
G'day, Wayne.
It's a very interesting situation. The Essential poll has been released, and what we find is that it may not be necessarily as negative towards Barnaby Joyce taking the leadership of the Nationals.
Well, what this poll shows is that the kind of things Barnaby Joyce has been on about are the actual things that Australians are on about, according to what the Essential poll published in The Guardian said yesterday.
Okay, give us some of the figures which that seem to indicate some changes in the way in which Australians are thinking, even over the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, the big one is the question, do you think Australia is doing enough to address climate change? Now, we had Mr Rudd and Mrs Gillard and then Mr Turnbull on and on and on about climate change over the history of these polls. But the question, is Australia doing enough to handle climate change? 56% got up to 62% last January, but then funnily enough, when COVID came along, that's been tracking right down to 45% think Australia's not doing enough on climate change. So there's not a majority now that think we need to be doing more.
And it's very interesting because we see that this morning discussion about whether Mr Joyce is moving towards, say, a greater look at coal and gas as our energy reserves and how we export those and maybe how we use them ourselves. So is there a feeling there that maybe with the way in which the Morrison government was moving, that maybe people are not necessarily in total support of that?
Well, this poll does show a movement upwards in the renewable energy desires of people, but we would focus that these polls are about metropolitan audiences largely. It would tilt more heavily in the traditional resource sources in regional areas. So there's a solid 15% of Australians that say new coal-fired power stations are the way to go. Another 12% say new gas-fired power stations are the way to go. But the other 73% think renewables are the way to go.
Still a high amount that say renewables are the way to go. But when we look at the energy market operator, it puts out a graph every day. But at the moment, each day that graph is looked at, it seems to be around about the same, that we are around about the 80% of our energy still comes from coal and from gas, with a very small component still coming from renewables. If we were to move towards that, is it possible to do that in the next 20 years to 30 years in terms of zero emissions?
Well, it's not realistic, and that's where I think the 70-30 split that you're seeing there between renewables and traditional resources is the same as the population split between country and city people in Australia. Either city people who know country people or those who live in the country say the same common sense that you've just sprouted just then.
Okay, let's have a look at this poll in relation to China.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a move that said that we should be looking at Asia and we shouldn't be looking at these free trade agreements with the United Kingdom and America and so forth, this Trans-Pacific Partnership, that we should concentrate ourselves in our region, and China should be somebody we should engage significantly more with on a trade basis. We've seen, obviously, the trade wars of this last 12 months, and in the poll, how does China register for people in cities who are actually voting about whether or not they see China's influence as being a good thing?
Well, it's been a dramatic shift since August of 2019. We had in these poll data, the question was, who would you choose between the US or China as most beneficial for Australia to strengthen relationship with? In August 2019, US 38%, China 28%. So reasonably close. In June, the poll that's just come out, US 57%, China 14%. That's a massive shift of public sentiment in the metropolitan areas that we need to get closer to America and move away from China.
And of course, backbenchers from the Nationals like George Christensen are going to be influencing Barnaby Joyce over things like the Darwin port and so forth. And so we could see an even greater push towards the United States and towards the UK in terms of trading.
Oh, absolutely. And what we need to remember back on that renewables debate is the exports of iron ore and coal that are reliant on our energy mix that we have at the moment are going to Asian countries that aren't going to punish us for not moving fast enough on climate change. It's only the woke Americans and the woke European Union that are going to want to move on climate change. Those Asian nations say we're still growing. We need all of those resources. Thank you very much from Australia.
It's an interesting topic of conversation, Rikki. Good to talk to you about it this morning here on The Morning Show.